On May 3, 1946, a death row inmate named Willie Francis felt 2,000 volts of electricity course through his body in an electric chair. By all medical logic, he should have died. But miraculously, Willie survived. That is just one of a series of unbelievable stories about people who faced death, survived it, and left haunting marks in the history of capital punishment. Here are 10 stories of death row inmates who survived execution, and what happened next will make you question the line between justice and cruelty. The first story takes us to Alabama, where on November 17, 2022, Kenneth Smith, a contract killer, entered the execution chamber. In the 1980s, Smith had received $11,000 from a pastor named Charles Sinnett to kill his wife, Elizabeth Sinnett. Charles, drowning in massive debt, planned to kill his wife to collect insurance money. The plan collapsed, Smith was caught, and after 33 years on death row, execution day finally came. But what happened in the execution chamber wasn't death, it was torture lasting 4 hours. 3 medical staff members couldn't find a suitable vein to inject the poison. They repeatedly jabbed needles into Smith's arms while he screamed and begged them to stop. In desperation, they even stabbed into muscle, causing excruciating pain. Smith later recounted, "When they couldn't find a vein, they ordered the table tilted so my feet pointed at the ceiling and my head down to the floor, like being crucified upside down. Their masks were covered with my blood, and finally they stabbed into my collarbone to reach the subclavian artery. After 4 hours, they returned him to his cell." Smith had escaped death temporarily, but the state of Alabama didn't accept failure. On January 25, 2024, they decided to use a method never before used in U.S. execution history: nitrogen gas asphyxiation. Smith, 58 years old, was fitted with a gas mask and strapped to the table. His final words rang out through the sealed mask. "Tonight, Alabama causes humanity to take a step backward. I'm leaving with love, peace, and light." Witnesses saw him convulse violently on the table for 25 minutes. This time, there was no escape. Kenneth Smith became the first person executed by nitrogen gas in the United States, a death many called an experiment in cruelty. Also in America, on September 15, 2009, Romell Broom, who raped and murdered young girl Trina Middleton, entered the execution chamber in Ohio. But like Smith, he escaped death. For more than 2 hours, execution staff tried to find a vein to inject poison. They jabbed needles into Broom's arms, hands, and calves relentlessly. Broom screamed in pain. Finally, Ohio was forced to order a halt. He was returned to his cell, and his lawyers successfully delayed execution for many years. Broom even wrote a book about this horrific experience. On December 20, 2020, Romell Broom died, not from lethal injection, but from COVID-19. He had escaped the state's hand and lived 11 more years. Going back in time to 1740 in England, a teenager named William Doole was hanged for being an accomplice in the assault of Sarah Griffin. After hanging for about 20 minutes, his body was declared dead and transferred to a surgical theater for dissection. But when doctors removed his clothes and placed him on the operating table, one of them noticed something strange. Doole was still breathing, very slowly. Over the next several hours, his breathing gradually quickened until he could sit up and speak. It was a horrifying moment for the doctors. They had almost dissected a living person. News spread, and the public celebrated his miraculous survival. Eventually, Doole was pardoned due to mental impairment from the shock, and his death sentence was commuted to transportation to North America. He lived until around 1805 in Boston, carrying with him the story of the death he had experienced, and escaped. On February 23, 1885 in England, a man named John Lee stepped onto the gallows. The rope tightened around his neck, a hood covered his head, and the executioner pulled the lever to open the trap door. But nothing happened. The trap door didn't open. The executioner tried again, still didn't open. He tried once more, and again. The trapdoor remained shut as if an invisible hand held it closed. John Lee, 21 years old, had been convicted of murdering his employer, Emma Kais, in her own home. The only evidence against him was that he was the only man present in the house that night, along with a criminal record and a few cuts on his arm. Lee always maintained his innocence, and throughout his time standing on the gallows, he remained calm, believing God would save him. The scene became embarrassing for everyone present. The sheriff decided to halt the execution and return Lee to his cell. They examined the trapdoor mechanism. It worked perfectly. Every test was successful. But as soon as Lee was placed on it again, the trapdoor wouldn't open. The crowd began whispering about a miracle. Eventually, a judge commuted Lee's death sentence to life imprisonment. Years later, new evidence suggested there may have been another man in the house the night the crime occurred, and Lee was released in 1907. His fate afterward remains a mystery. Some sources say he died in an asylum in Tavistock during World War II. Others say he went to America, became a speaker, and died in Milwaukee. Whatever the truth, John Lee will forever be remembered as the man they couldn't hang. Going back to 1650, Anne Green, a 22-year-old servant in England, was hanged for infanticide. Anne worked in the home of Sir Thomas Red, a justice of the peace in Oxfordshire. There, she was seduced by her employer's grandson, Geoffrey Red, and became pregnant. At 17 weeks, Anne miscarried. Terrified of retribution, she tried to hide the remains of the fetus but was discovered. She was charged with infanticide and sentenced to hang. On December 14, 1650, Anne was executed at the famous Oxford Castle. Her body hung for 30 minutes before being taken down, placed in a coffin, and delivered to doctors at Oxford University for dissection. That's when the impossible happened. After 24 hours without food, water, and almost no oxygen, just before the doctors began dissecting the body, one of them noticed Anne still had a pulse. They were horrified to see Anne gently stirring. Immediately, he and the other doctors began resuscitation, giving her medication until finally she could speak and move. 3 days later, Sir Thomas Red died, no longer having the power to revoke Anne's pardon. However, the case caused an uproar, with a group demanding she be executed again. Fortunately, no one listened to them, and Anne was released. Many viewed her story as divine intervention, a miracle that saved her from death. Anne went on to live a peaceful life, married, had 3 children, and died in 1659. And now, the story that opened this video, Willie Francis. In 1944, a pharmacist named Andrew Thomas in St. Martinville, Louisiana, was found dead after multiple gunshots. It was said that Thomas had abused young people in the area, and many believed Willie Francis might have been one of the victims. 9 months later, in August 1945, Willie, only 16 years old, was arrested as the prime suspect. Police said they found Thomas's wallet on him, but no evidence proved this. Moreover, the weapon used in the crime belonged to the deputy sheriff, August Fusilier, which raised doubts about Willie's guilt. Despite the lack of evidence, Willie was forced to sign 2 handwritten confessions, likely obtained under duress. His trial was a farce. The defense attorney called no witnesses, made no objections, and in just 2 days, an all-white jury convicted him and sentenced him to death. On May 3, 1946, Willie was brought to the electric chair, but the execution failed. The portable electric chair was installed by a drunk prison employee, causing the current to be insufficient to kill him. Against all odds, Willie Francis survived. After this event, attorney Bertrand de Blanc took his case and appealed to the Supreme Court, arguing not only that the execution was inhumane, but that there were serious errors in the trial. Among them, crucial evidence like the murder weapon and Andrew Thomas's body disappeared days before the trial. Despite evidence showing the judicial process was riddled with errors, the Supreme Court rejected the appeal. On May 9, 1947, 1 year after the first execution attempt, Willie Francis was brought to the electric chair again. This time, there was no malfunction. His final words were directed to a reporter. "I'm going to meet God in my Sunday clothes and with my Sunday heart." To this day, his case remains a reminder of errors in the justice system and the cruelty of capital punishment. If there's one state that deserves to be banned from carrying out lethal injection executions, it's Alabama. On September 22, 2022, Alan Eugene Miller was brought to the execution chamber for killing 3 people: Lee Holdbrooks, Christopher Scott Yancey, and Terry Jarvis, in a paranoid episode in 1999. But what happened next turned an execution into brutal torture. When it came time for the execution, staff encountered serious difficulty finding a suitable vein to insert the IV. For an hour and a half, they repeatedly jabbed needles into Miller's arms, hands, and feet, but without success. In desperation, they began stabbing needles into various other parts of his body. Miller remained conscious throughout this process, feeling every stab and the pain it caused. After nearly 2 hours of failure, they strapped him tightly to the table with chest restraints, tilting him upright with his bleeding limbs. Then, the execution staff left the room, leaving Miller alone, bound and badly injured. 30 minutes later, he was removed from the table, his wounds were treated, and he was returned to his cell. Alan Eugene Miller had survived his execution. This was Alabama's 3rd failure in 4 years, a shameful record that sparked fierce debate about the humanity of lethal injection as an execution method. Miller's lawyers continued to fight to change the execution method, arguing that Alabama had proven its inability to carry out lethal injection effectively. Finally, on September 26, 2024, Alan Eugene Miller was executed by nitrogen gas asphyxiation, just like Kenneth Smith before him. This time, there was no malfunction. But if there's a record for the most survival attempts after execution, that record belongs to John Smith. Born in 1661, Smith was a burglar in London. But before entering a life of crime, he had served in the Navy as a merchant sailor and then as a soldier on ships until being discharged after the famous Battle of Vigo Bay. Not long after, he enlisted as a soldier and began associating with bad company, ultimately leading him to a life of crime. On December 5, 1705, he was convicted of 2 crimes and sentenced to death. Initially, Smith wasn't too worried, but when it came time for execution, his family caused a major riot, trying to reduce Smith's pain during the execution process. He was hanged for about 15 minutes without dying, so he was taken down and brought to a nearby house to recover. On February 20, 1706, John was released due to the psychological trauma he suffered from the botched execution. That was the first time. However, after being released, he returned to his old stealing habits, and less than 6 months later, he was arrested again for the same crime. Although previously convicted, he avoided harsher punishment due to the complexity of the case. That was the second time. Clearly, Smith didn't deserve the leniency granted, and he was arrested a 3rd time for robbery. This time, it seemed execution was inevitable, but just before the trial, the prosecutor died, causing him to be released once again. That was the 3rd time. People with such astonishing luck are truly rare, and most surprisingly, Smith's luck had not yet run out. On May 17, 1727, at age 66, John Smith was arrested for attempting to steal a padlock with a friend. While his friend escaped, Smith was caught and brought before court. It was discovered he was trying to break into a warehouse, which led to his 3rd conviction. He was sentenced to be transported as a prisoner to Virginia, United States. Smith requested corporal punishment be imposed on him, but the mayor refused his request. Eventually, he was sent far from London, leaving his family behind. It's uncertain what happened to Smith after his relocation, but it's hoped that luck accompanied him to the very end of his life. In 1795, a German man named Joseph Samuel was sentenced to be transported as a prisoner to England. However, what he did next was completely unthinkable, leading him straight to a death sentence, though fate had other plans for him. At the time, England had a penal settlement in Sydney, and Samuel, along with other prisoners, escaped from that settlement and returned to England. After escaping, they robbed the home of a wealthy woman, and during the robbery, they killed the police officer guarding the house. Because this woman was wealthy and an official had been killed, authorities launched a fierce manhunt to capture Samuel and his gang. At trial, the woman specifically identified Samuel as one of the perpetrators. Samuel admitted to the robbery but denied killing the officer. However, because he was the only one identified, he was sentenced to death while the others were released due to lack of evidence. On September 26, 1803, Samuel and other prisoners were hanged. The ropes used for execution were strong enough to support up to 450 kilograms, meaning they could easily hang a human. While the other prisoners died from strangulation, Samuel's rope broke and he fell to the ground. This shocked everyone. The executioner quickly prepared another rope, also capable of supporting 450 kilograms, and placed it around Samuel's neck. He was pulled up again, but as soon as the cart beneath his feet was moved away, the rope loosened and Samuel fell to the ground once more. The executioner was confused, knowing he had adjusted the rope properly. Samuel had sprained his ankle from the falls and was in great pain. Once again, the executioner prepared a new rope, ordered the cart to lift him up, and carefully adjusted the rope. This time, when the cart moved away, the rope failed a third time, causing Samuel to fall to the ground again. The crowd began cheering, calling for Samuel's release, and the situation became riotous. The sheriff ordered the execution stopped until the governor arrived. When the governor came to the scene and examined the ropes, there were no signs they had been cut, and seeing that other prisoners had died with the same ropes, he agreed with the crowd that this was perhaps a sign from God that Joseph Samuel did not commit a crime deserving execution. As a result, his death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. And to end this list, we have a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Born on November 1st, 1896, Wenceslao Moguel was a Mexican soldier under the command of General Francisco Villa. However, after the start of the Mexican Revolution, Wenceslao was captured and sentenced to death by firing squad. Execution by firing squad is one of the most brutal forms of execution a condemned person can face. But somehow, Wenceslao survived. In that execution, he was shot 8 to 9 times in the body, and as a final measure, they shot him directly in the head at close range to ensure his death. But after everything was over, Wenceslao realized he was still alive. Nevertheless, he decided to play dead to avoid being killed again. When his body was taken down, Wenceslao crawled through the night to the Santiago Apostol Church, 3 blocks away. A church member found him and took him home, where he recovered, though permanently scarred and disfigured. Wenceslao survived that execution, a testament to the extraordinary human will to live. These 10 stories are not just strange anecdotes in history. They are painful reminders of the cruelty and tragedy behind capital punishment. Each story raises questions about the humanity of taking human life, about the errors of the justice system, and about the fragile line between justice and torture. From technical failures to racial discrimination, from wrongful convictions to intentional cruelty, these stories expose deep flaws in how we handle crime and punishment. These stories are not just about miraculous survival, but also about scars that never heal, pain that never fades, and questions about justice that humanity still has no answer for.